Deeply pious, Louis IX, King of France, was devastated by news that Jerusalem had fallen to the Muslims again in 1244, and vowed to lead an army to the Holy City's relief. Louis had ample means to accomplish this, for the Kingdom of France had reached a point of considerable wealth. Louis took meticulous care to personally ensure that his crusade was well-financed, well-provisioned, and well-planned. Genoese fleets transported the French forces, and food and supplies were stockpiled on Cyprus in anticipation of the Crusade's arrival. On August 25th, 1248, Louis's fleet sailed, arriving on Cyprus by September. The French king announced that he intended to campaign in Egypt, drawing on the now standard wisdom that the conqueror of Cairo would control Jerusalem. Louis held long sessions with his war council, going over the events of the Fifth Crusade, trying to ensure that his own strategy would avoid its errors. Louis's fleet departed Cyprus in May 1249, arriving at Damietta on June 4. The Sultan of Egypt, As-Salih, positioned an army on the west bank to prevent a French landing, but Louis's galleys were equipped to open on the beach and allow the knights to charge straight onto the land. As-Salih's troops retreated before the heavy French cavalry, while the garrison of Damietta panicked and fled. Thus Louis was able to immediately occupy the city. As-Salih established his forces south of Damietta at Mansoura. Meanwhile, Louis decided to advance on Cairo, and on November 20th, the French began a slow march south down the Nile, establishing bases all along the way to avoid being cut off from Damietta like the Fifth Crusade. Suddenly, As-Salih fell ill and died, while the Sultan's men sent for As-Salih's heir, who was in Syria. The Emir Fakhr al-Din organized opposition to the Crusaders. An Egyptian trader came before Louis to reveal the location of a ford downriver. Louis dispatched Robert of Artois with a detachment to make a surprise attack on Fakhr al-Din's camp before Mansoura. Robert achieved total surprise and destroyed Fakhr al-Din's force, killing the emir himself, but then rashly ordered an assault on Mansoura before Louis could join him with the main body. Mansoura's garrison defeated Robert, by which time Egyptian reinforcements arrived to confront the main Crusader army. In the following battle, Louis's forces suffered a serious defeat that so reduced their numbers that an attack on Cairo was now unthinkable. Illness spread through the French army. The new Sultan, Turan Shah, arrived and managed to cut off the supply lines to Damietta. Louis's crusade was now in exactly the same position as the Fifth Crusade had been at its most desperate hour, but in a far weaker condition. Turan Shah slaughtered the Christian infantry, who would bring no ransom, but captured Louis and his high-ranking knights. Soon after this, the Sultan's own Mamluk officers revolted suddenly and overthrew the Ayyubid regime, stabbing Turan Shah to death. The Mamluks negotiated with the French occupying Damietta. An enormous ransom for the king was raised. On May 6th, Damietta was surrendered to the Mamluks, and the king, along with a good portion of the upper nobility, were released from captivity. The remnants of Louis's army limped on to Acre. The king would remain in the Holy Land for a further 4 years, improving the fortifications of Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon, and acting as de facto ruler of the kingdom. Although his crusade had failed, Louis's presence in Outremer proved incredibly harmonizing, since everyone trusted him. During his brief stay, the usual quarreling factions were united in purpose. Louis established a permanent French garrison at Acre to bolster the city's staff of Templars, Hospitallers, and secular troops. Then finally, in 1254, he returned home. The Seventh Crusade outdid the Second Crusade and the Fifth Crusade in the extent of its defeat. In every corner of Europe there was mourning over the pious king's failure, but for centuries to come, Louis's crusade would be widely admired among the people of Christendom for the nobility of his goal. The Seventh Crusade did manage to destabilize Egypt enough to facilitate the collapse of the Ayyubid dynasty, though the new Muslim ruling elite, the Mamluks, would prove to be far more dedicated to holy war than any of Saladin's worldly heirs had ever been. Thus, while Louis's stay in the Holy Land in the aftermath of his failure proved beneficial to the Crusader states in the short term, ultimately the rise of the Mamluks would be a calamity with long-lasting consequences. Unlike the Ayyubids, the Mamluks committed themselves to the elimination of the Crusader presence in the Levant. A striking feature of the Seventh Crusade is its similarity in course to the Fifth Crusade. Louis had taken great pains to avoid the mishaps of the Fifth Crusade, yet in the end his defeat was far more serious than anything suffered by the Fifth Crusaders. The army of the Fifth Crusade had remained intact to the end, but Louis's army was annihilated. In terms of lives lost and the scope of the defeat, it's difficult to find a more serious disaster in the history of the Crusades. The Mamluk Baybars became Sultan of Egypt in 1260 and embarked on a decade of conquests in the Crusader kingdom, capturing Arsuf, Caesarea, Safad, and Jaffa. At every turn, Baybars slaughtered and enslaved Christians, until 1268, when he conquered Antioch, one of the great capitals of Crusader Outremer, having stood for some 170 years. Baybars' men slaughtered every Christian they could get their hands on, save the pretty women and young boys who lived out their lives in sex slavery. Far away in the Kingdom of France, an aging Louis IX heard reports of the losses in the East, and was much troubled. At an assembly of barons, Louis declared his intentions to lead a new crusade. This time, his council universally opposed the idea. Most of Louis's knights believed his crusading dreams were the ideals of a youth that the king should have long ago set aside. As usual, the king was undeterred, and with the Pope's aid, set about organizing a new crusade. He spared no amount of care and preparation, and if anything, Louis's second crusade was better organized and better funded than his first. This was a reflection of the widespread reforms Louis had cultivated in France, which had allowed his kingdom to rise to new levels of prosperity and efficiency like never before. Louis's brother, Charles of Anjou, who had recently become King of Sicily, was closely involved with the planning, but the two were quite secretive about where they intended to direct the crusade. Most assumed Louis would once again attempt a conquest of Egypt, but just before embarking via a Genoese fleet, Louis assembled his barons and announced that they were headed for Tunis. Everyone was stunned. If Louis intended to cut a path to the Holy Land from Tunis, he certainly had a long war ahead of him. But the destination was a sensible target. Tunis lay on the North African coast directly opposite from Sicily, which was now controlled by Louis's brother. The city was poorly defended, and a siege could be easily supplied from Sicily. Plus, the capture of Tunis would make Louis and his brother the masters of the Western Mediterranean. The Crusaders put ashore on Tunisia on July 18th, 1270. They quickly captured a Muslim fortress on the site of ancient Carthage, setting up a base there. While Louis and his council prepared their next move, an outbreak of disease spread suddenly through the army's ranks. North African summers are notoriously deadly, especially for foreigners. Many soldiers fell ill, and soon even Louis's own sons, Philip and Jean, took sick. When Jean died, Louis was heartbroken. By August, Louis himself was confined to a sickbed, his condition rapidly deteriorating. It soon became apparent that the king would not recover. On the night of August 24th, after receiving last rites, Louis was heard to call out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," as he lay in a feverish sweat. With his men all around him, he died. An unspeakable sorrow fell over the Crusaders. Louis had been deeply loved by his people, and his passing would be mourned all across Europe. Louis's son Philip, the heir to the throne, was still recovering from his illness, and so responsibility of the Crusade's command fell on Charles of Anjou. Charles, who shared little in his brother's Crusader idealism, was eager to be done with the whole affair and get back to his own kingdom. He immediately opened negotiations with the Emir of Tunis, Muhammad I. Muhammad was quite eager to come to terms with Charles, essentially offering to become a vassal to the Kingdom of Sicily. The emir proposed that Sicily receive special trading rights with Tunis, and offered to pay an enormous indemnity of 210,000 gold ounces, to be followed by annual tribute. Muhammad also agreed to allow the free proselytizing of Christianity throughout his emirate, and released Christian captives held in Tunis. Charles found these terms quite acceptable, and by November, the crusade withdrew. Louis's final crusade is in many ways the crusade that never really was. Before any major operations could be undertaken, illness spread through the army, and the king himself died. Charles of Anjou gained more than anyone, with the submission of the Emir Muhammad proving enormously lucrative to the Sicilian crown. The loss of King Louis brought mourning to all of Christendom. Although his crusades had been failures, his reputation for holiness was in no way diminished, with his memory treasured even to this day. For Crusader Outremer, the crusade truly achieved nothing, with the coastal Levantine cities still in peril. However, another crusade was about to put in on the shores of Outremer itself, the Ninth Crusade,